Welcome back. You're still watching SA Today, and we're continuing with our conversation, unpacking the President's response to the debate yesterday on his State of the Nation address. And we're now added another voice to this conversation, Angelo Fick, who's Director of Research from the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you.
All right, before we get into sort of details of things, perhaps let's start with your perspective, your thoughts, listening to the President's response today.
I think it's a response that is very much in the spirit of everything that I've heard from President Ramaphosa since he first came back into prominence in February of 2018. These are lofty ideals, these are interesting, visions for the future, and in a country where for so long we've had a missing vision, where what was being promulgated was immediate and short-term, this medium-term vision, one admires the desire for a medium-term idea of South Africa. It is in the substance of what that idea is that I think there will be some differences. I sort of echo Stephen Friedman here when he says that everyone is bound to be disappointed by the state of the nation, and so the response here is not a defense of, but an explanation of what he had proposed. And so I didn't expect a radical departure. I didn't expect much more interesting stuff to come out. What I did hear was a view and a vision of a future in South Africa that will be a future for the few, not a future for the majority, principally because of the resources available, principally because of the challenges that we will have to meet, and principally because of what is happening in South Africa's present, which is not going to be addressed simply by that vision of a very nice techno future that looks like Star Trek on a planet that doesn't look like Star Trek.
All right, so let's now start unpacking some of the things that he did say. And I suppose one of the challenges that he had is that he's been president a while now. It's been a year and a bit, so he can't speak as if he's just got into office and this is what he's starting to do. Do you think that he was able to at least put on the table some of the things that he's been able to achieve, if he has in fact been able to achieve anything?
Has he? So, I mean, he's been very reiterative. It's all about restating, reframing, and reminding. And there's value in that because in some respects it builds a level of consistency and it reminds us that we should be, that there's resonance in what he's trying to achieve. And sometimes, if you say something long enough, it begins to capture some kind of an imagination. But the tangibles are really lacking. So I'd like to hear in relation to, for example, the ease of doing business. I'd like to hear, for example, how many new businesses have we in the last 12 months, for example? Local business, have we seen emerging? How many jobs have those produced? And what kind of the numbers that we can see them projected to contribute to the GDP? Those are like the concrete things. It would also be good to see, these Aeropolitan or what, Angelo Star Trek cities. What do those look like? Because those actually encompass the 7 priorities. You talk about social cohesion, a place without homelessness, a place where nobody is hungry, and so on and so forth, a better Africa, a better South Africa. I mean, these are all grand. And any one of those is a grand, lofty idea, a place where there's a social wage, meaning that people are able to access public utilities, which are not necessarily commensurate to their income. So, basic good education for all, good health for all. How do we get there? What's the cost of that? The President also mentioned the national health insurance, which again has been floating around for a good 10, 12 years. And I don't think anybody has been able to land that very effectively. I mean, there's always an outcry around where the money, firstly, where the money is going to come from, what the interface is between that and existing private medical schemes, and also how then public hospitals and private hospitals are going to interface in that regard, because it actually requires a health policy rationalization between public and private utilities. So these sorts of things need to land a lot more clearly.
He said, if you thought that I could wave a magic wand and change things overnight, it's not going to happen. There's still quite a bit to be done and it's going to take a long time. Does that then give him some breathing space? Because I think maybe there might have been an enormous amount of expectation that he's trying to manage now.
Well, I think he's been managing the expectations even in the lead up to his, shall we call it, a takeover on Valentine's Day 2018. That change of regime, change of space. But it's now not just about managing expectations, it's also about managing people's demands for delivery on those expectations, because these are not new expectations. This is a party, this is a formation that came into political power through an election on the promise of a brand new direction. People are not going to wait another year, another 2 years, or another 5 years to see that direction. And so they're beginning to hook their hope onto little things, whether it is Premier Zamani Soul indicating that there's going to be cutback on the largesses and expenses of government officials. People are going to want to know what are the specific details of each of those ministerial, performance agreements. And it will be incumbent on the President to start announcing them as soon as possible. He has now been with his administration in that position for just over a month. We've had the elections, we've had the outcomes, we've had the inauguration. People are going to want to see those changes. And so in some places it is going to be a hard haul. So at ESCOM it's going to be tough, it's going to be difficult. This may well be a winter of yet another discontent, but that is not going to be resolved in the short term. But people's ability to go to their local government official and get responses, get service delivery, that the price to be paid for not working, for not delivering, should become payable in the short term within the ambit of the confines of the rule of law, but certainly there should be a commitment to following that up. We cannot have one State Capture Commission, PIC inquiry, all of that happening, but it's business or non-business as usual. So as you indicated, how many businesses have been opened? And more than that, of the businesses in their first 2 years of operation, have they indeed, what help is being given for people who feel their businesses are at risk in an economy that is, continuing to sort of struggle along? And those are the details that I think ordinary people want to see. The bigger picture, that's lovely to hear, the hope that's in there, that's fantastic, but people want to see results and want to feel it every day.
And I suppose today, of all days, the Auditor General releases his report and says that there's, 18 only from 257 municipalities that have got clean audits. And yet he was talking about, we are turning things around, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So today probably wasn't the best day to have the Auditor General's report coming through.
No.
And this is where people experience government firsthand, is at local municipality level. So you'd think probably that this is where most of the work needs to happen straight away.
So consequence management at that level is quite important. I don't know. I haven't met my local councillor. I wouldn't know them if I ran them over, if I bumped into them at Pick and Pay. I have no idea who this person is, which just illustrates the extent to which there's such a disconnect, such a dissonance between our elected officials and us, not even an attempt to do any door-to-door city town hall meetings. And if I'm experiencing that from a position of relative privilege, I cannot imagine what somebody who's living with less access to privilege, less access to information, what they're living with, especially when the realities of survival day to day are extremely acute. It must seem incredibly jarring to have voted in a particular, or to have gone through the motion of a democratic process which isn't quantifiably improving one's livelihood and one's life in the short or the immediate term. And I think linked to that is the idea that really there is not the consequence management is incredibly weak, isn't it? We have the Zondos and the PICs. Heads aren't rolling perhaps at the pace that many of us would have expected, and even the heads that are rolling are really quite the minions who are not really the big heads that are rolling, and people are looking at this and thinking, well, there's this talk on corruption is really just talk, it's just lip service, it's business unusual, it's shady business as usual, in fact, and that's really depressing, and that seems to be the cry that one is looking at, in conversations with people on social media, that there's no way that we're going to be able to generate fresh income, fresh jobs, for as long as public sentiment, investor sentiment, business sentiment, who are also watching this, feel that there isn't the ground to land this appropriately.
Is this going to make his job of, because he keeps on saying, we have to do this together, we can't do it alone. Is it going to make it harder for people to buy into his call to action together. He's saying we've got differences, yes, but we've only got one South Africa. We can only fix it together. Is all of this going to make it harder for people to say, okay, we'll go with you?
I don't know if it makes it harder for people to, participate in this, but it does present a challenge to South Africans to behave as civic agents. And this is not about simply sitting back and poking holes, which many people think one is doing when one is doing critique. Critique of the president's plan, critique of government's plan, critique of government's actions is not to poke holes in a cynical way, but it is to do one's duty as a citizen to hold people accountable and to remind those elected officials who sit in the legislature that they have a role to play in relation to the executive, which is about more than applauding. And that cannot be simply about party loyalty. We've had constitutional court judgments reminding us that those people who take the oath of MPs take an oath to be loyal to the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees 58 million people who live here all sorts of things that those people, as the people's representatives, have to do. One of them is to hold the executive to account. Part of that holding to account is to continue to ask for details, to continue to monitor what comes out of those actions, and to suggest to government when it does not perform, where it is not performing, and for what reasons. So all of that has to happen. But citizens increasingly also have to take some responsibility and to intervene. And here I'm not talking about the ordinary poor, majority in South Africa. They do that every day, whether in the form of public protests, whether in the form of demands. I'm talking about those of us who live in the middle classes, whose lives have remained vaguely manageable, with many things that we complain about, but that we need to increasingly put pressure on government to deliver using the means at our disposal. Because in some senses the president is making an understatement. It isn't all of us in South Africa or none of us at all. It is all of us on the planet or none of us at all. And that means that there needs to be a downscaling of our consumption levels and an upscaling of our responsiveness and responsibility about being alive in the early 20th century in South Africa.
All right, so now for both of you, I'm going to start asking you to wear different hats because there's different stakeholders, and one of the most affected is the youth. So if you're young in South Africa and you switched on the TV this afternoon and you heard the president, you heard the opposition yesterday talk about it and poke holes, as you were saying, what would the youth be saying, thinking, feeling as a result of what they've heard today? Are they hopeful or less hopeful, or are we going to continue to ignore this process?
So I haven't been young for a really long time, believe it or not, but I do think that, I think of my own, I've got two teens of my own. They are not inspired, that I know. I think that there's a sense in which youth is becoming a buzzword. They are being utilized and instrumentalized to try to galvanize popular support, the populist thinking, quick votes. It's a quick spin, let's talk to youth, let's do a side visit with youth, let's talk youth, let's put in place something called Yes, and that will also get people excited. The situation of young people right now is not different than it has been previously. The demographic bulge has always existed, and that's not only a South Africa thing, that's a continental thing. It's about the way that our economies are constructed, and in this country it's about a legacy of intergenerational poverty among African people, the African majority. It's about the kind of education system which was developed specifically for African people to service minority capital interests in this country and beyond. So that is an intergenerational phenomena. It's certainly not a fresh one. What we do need is to hear in a tangible way ways in which we can begin to remediate that. The education system being a quick gain, and that's not about tablets, and that's not about coding. That's about yes, reading with understanding, but also enjoying the process of learning and making the process of learning and education one that is conducive, one that's exciting, and one that is actually meaningful, where you can create multiple entry points and pathways into the market economy. It's not just about having a BCom. It's about validating different forms of work, internships, voluntary work, different forms of life experience, but also ensuring that young people are not just being spoken at, but are part of carving economic, social, political solutions to the and in language that they also understand. I just think we're running the risk of fetishizing young people.
Angelo, as I look at this house and I see the people sitting in there, they're mostly my age. Is that part of the disconnect, do you think? Is that part of why the language that's being used and spoken isn't speaking to young people.
It's not just the people.
Yeah.
It's the processes by which those people become the people who represent us. So it's not just a parliamentary problem or an executive problem. It is the problem inside our political organizations. It is the part of the organization of power in our society. And again, there, as Lebohang pointed out, this is not exceptional. South African exceptionalism must go out the window. We are living out patterns that have been lived out before elsewhere in the world, both on this continent and across the global south. And those of the people who sit in these parliamentary situations and get 1.3 million and more per year of tax money need to begin to think and look to those other predecessors and go, what happened in those societies? Because this is not sustainable. You cannot have people who live in the way that the elite in this country live, and they're the minority, continue to have the life they have in a society where the majority are not just impoverished, but impoverished in a fated, inescapable way. That has to shift, and for that to shift, the dream of the future needs to be different, because currently too many of us dream simply about the status quo, keeping what we have or regaining what we think we've lost, which we had before. Alternatively, we want more of what is going around right now. That cannot be. There is one pie. It is one blue marble that floats in a very uninteresting neighborhood in the galaxy. It has very finite resources. We are running out of some of those resources. And the question that our political class governing the society has to ask is, how do we get young people to not only understand the present, but understand what needs to be done now in the future? And for that, perhaps the old, and there's no other way of saying it, who currently govern, need to rethink what they imagine the future is. Because the future isn't this. Mike Davis, various other people have pointed out that this idea of the super slick science fiction future, where everything is fantastic, that is the vision of an inside and an outside. Whatever new city is going to be built, that might be the inside. And the question has to be, what happens outside the walls of that city? Because we have that phenomenon in contemporary South Africa, where the majority poor amass on the outside of city walls that aren't necessarily in the CBDs anymore, but the walls are there, and that is not sustainable.
All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, our next stakeholder is going to be business, because in theory, it's the businesses that build the economy, that provide the jobs. Will they be inspired by what they heard, and what else do they need to hear for us to follow him to this vision? Okay, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back right after this.